The year was 1887, a time caught between superstition and science, when the world moved forward on iron rails and flickering lamps, yet clung stubbornly to the shadows of its own past. Across Europe, families mourned more children than they raised, and illness lingered in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. Death was a constant companion, and in this world, photographs were rare and precious, yet they often captured not life, but loss. Families stood stiff and silent before the camera's eye, desperate to preserve a fading memory. Sometimes, the only picture ever taken of a child was after the child had already died. Post-mortem photography, a chilling tradition that now serves as a haunting reminder of a vanished age. In a small town, nearly forgotten, the story of one boy began to unfold. The family seemed ordinary at first. Farmers, churchgoers, respectable, at least by the brittle standards of the time. But look closely at the photographs that survive, and something unsettling reveals itself. The mother's expression is too strained, her gaze heavy and unsettled. The father stands stiff, a hand on his son's shoulder, but his eyes are sharp and watchful, almost defensive. And the boy, he does not smile. He never smiles. His thin frame, pale skin, and sunken eyes gave him the look of one already fading. Even in images meant to preserve life, he seemed closer to death. The boy was different from other children. While the others played, he stayed inside. He avoided laughter, avoided games, avoided the sunlight itself. He preferred scraps of paper, bits of charcoal, and silence. To his family, it was a strange but harmless habit. To the townspeople, it was something far darker. They whispered that the boy spoke in strange ways, that he seemed to know things no child could know. They said he once asked a grieving widow about the color of her husband's coffin, days before the coffin was even built. It was easy to dismiss, at first. Children have imaginations. They see what others cannot. But this boy's imagination was not filled with the fantasies of childhood. His drawings were graveyards, coffins, mourners, endless funerals of people he had never met. Each image seemed to whisper of something lurking beyond the veil, and each one carried eerie details that matched real deaths that came later. One surviving sketch is especially disturbing. At first glance, it looks simple, rough lines, uneven shadows. A church, a crowd of mourners, a small coffin at the center. But the longer you stare, the more the image begins to crawl under your skin. The windows of the church are precise, their shape unmistakable, matching exactly the real building that still stood in the town at the time. The faces in the crowd are not vague blurs. They are clear, distinct, and chillingly familiar, people who would attend a funeral weeks later, in precisely the positions he had drawn. But the most haunting detail lies at the bottom of the sketch, a name carved into a headstone. His own. The boy showed it to his mother without fear, without hesitation. He spoke of it as though it were inevitable. His words, according to the fragments of family testimony that survive, were chillingly calm. "This is how it will be." His mother wept, but she hid the drawing, locking it away as though burying it would prevent the prophecy from coming true. His father grew restless, uneasy, yet said nothing. And the boy? He simply went back to his paper, as though his task was not finished. Soon after, his health began to fade further. He grew pale, almost translucent. His eyes seemed distant, as though he was staring into something others could not see. Neighbors noticed the change. They stopped visiting the family, whispering instead about curses, about strange languages spoken at night, about flickering candlelight in the boy's window long after the house should have been dark. Some claimed the family was involved in rituals not meant to be seen, secrets forbidden by both church and law. The town's priest grew concerned. He visited the home once, and only once, after which he refused to speak of what he had seen inside. But witnesses claimed his face was ashen when he emerged, and he crossed himself 3 times before stepping back onto the street. Even now, more than a century later, researchers argue about what this means. Was the boy gifted with some unnatural sight? Did illness grant him visions as his body wasted away? Or was it the sinister influence of his strange family, their whispered rituals shaping him into something he was never meant to be? The truth remains locked in fragments, forgotten photographs, disturbing testimonies, and the single, terrifying drawing that survived. This was not a boy who dreamed of a bright future. This was a child who saw only death, and who etched his own demise into paper before it ever arrived. His life, his family, his drawings, they are all lost in time now. But what remains is enough to unsettle anyone who dares look too closely. And so the mystery begins, with a child who sketched his own funeral in the year 1887, a chilling detail preserved from an era when death was everywhere, but rarely predicted with such haunting precision. Yet the story does not end with the drawing. What followed was far darker, and far more disturbing than anyone in that small town could have imagined. He was not like the other children. Even in 1887, when childhood was often short and burdened by sickness and labor, this boy seemed set apart, as though he had been born under a shadow. His name appears in fragments of forgotten records, tucked between baptism entries and burial lists that fill the ledgers of his small European town. To most, he was just another child among many. But to those who lived closest to him, there was always something different, something they could not explain, though they felt it like a cold draft slipping through the cracks of a locked door. The boy preferred silence. While other children ran through fields or played with wooden toys in the dirt, he lingered on the edges, watching. His gaze unsettled people. It was not cruel, nor defiant, but too knowing, too heavy for a child's years. Neighbors often said his eyes seemed older than his face, like the gaze of someone who had already seen too much. His classmates avoided him, whispering that he spoke rarely, and when he did, his words carried strange weight, as though they were warnings. Teachers noticed his habits as well. While others scrawled their letters and numbers with clumsy hands, he filled the margins of his papers with drawings, not playful sketches of animals or houses, but scenes of funerals, processions, and coffins carried by black-clad figures. The teachers, uncomfortable yet bound by duty, scolded him and tried to redirect his hand toward more proper lessons. But the drawings returned, again and again, more detailed each time. At home, the family grew uneasy. His mother burned some of the drawings in the stove, but he simply drew them again, as though compelled. His father, stern and distant, dismissed the habit as foolishness, though his eyes betrayed unease whenever he glimpsed a coffin sketched too carefully, too accurately. Only the boy seemed untroubled. He would sit at the wooden table, hands blackened by charcoal, sketching scene after scene of death. The whispers in the town began to spread. In an era steeped in superstition, when people still believed in death omens and restless spirits, such drawings were not seen as harmless. Some said the boy was cursed. Others believed he had been marked by God, or perhaps by something far darker. Mothers told their children not to play with him, not to look too long into his eyes, lest his shadow follow them home. But his family's strangeness made the rumors grow. It was said that his grandmother spoke a forbidden language, words not recognized by the church. Neighbors claimed to hear chanting from the house late at night, though none dared step close enough to listen clearly. And when sickness struck the village, claiming 2 children within a single week, some pointed their fingers at the pale boy who never smiled, the boy who had already drawn 2 coffins days before the deaths occurred. The local priest, troubled by these whispers, began to take notice. He believed in the sinister power of suggestion, the dangers of dark imagination. Yet when he tried to confront the family, he was turned away at the door, told that the boy needed rest, that he was too sickly for visitors. The rejection only deepened the town's suspicion. In the absence of truth, the shadows grew taller. And still, the boy drew. His small, fragile body hunched over scraps of paper, hands trembling with strange determination. When asked why he chose such grim subjects, he gave an answer that sent chills down the spine of anyone who heard it. Because this is what I see. He claimed he did not invent these scenes. He insisted they came to him as visions, as glimpses of moments not yet lived. A funeral before it happened. A death before it came. It was too much for most to bear. Parents forbade their children from speaking his name. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid passing his house. Yet curiosity gnawed at them, and in hushed tones, they shared their fears. Was this child cursed? Or worse, did he carry the hidden truth of what was yet to come? One surviving account, found in the notes of a local schoolteacher, describes a chilling incident. The teacher had collected his papers one day, only to find a drawing of herself, standing in a black veil, beside a coffin. She scolded him, tore the paper, and locked it away. Days later, her brother died suddenly in an accident, and when she saw the coffin lowered into the earth, she froze. The scene was the same as the boy had drawn, down to the smallest detail. Whether coincidence or something more sinister, the story spread quickly. Now the town whispered not only about his strange family, but about the boy himself, about the possibility that his drawings were more than drawings, that they were prophecies. Still, the most chilling image of all was yet to come. The drawing that would mark him forever, the one that could not be dismissed, not even by the most skeptical eyes. The sketch that would depict not someone else's death, but his own. The first drawings were not discovered until years later, hidden among crumbling papers and forgotten belongings. But the accounts that survive are enough to paint a chilling picture. They were not the doodles of a child, careless and playful. No, these were deliberate, detailed, and disturbingly precise. The earliest sketch shows a narrow coffin, too small for an adult. 4 dark figures stand around it, their faces shadowed, their hands folded. At first glance, it could be dismissed as childish imagination, until one remembers that the funeral of a local child had taken place just days later. The boy was said to have shown the drawing to a classmate before the death occurred, whispering, "This is what I see." It was not the only time. Another drawing surfaced, a woman in black, her hand clutching a handkerchief, her posture broken with grief. Beside her was the shape of a freshly dug grave. Weeks later, a neighbor's wife died suddenly of fever, and those who attended her burial swore that the child had captured the exact moment, down to the tilt of her head, the flowers at her feet, the pattern of lace on her veil. The unsettling history of these sketches spread quickly. Teachers tried to confiscate them, parents tried to destroy them, but they seemed to appear again and again, as though the boy could not stop himself. Some swore that when he drew, his eyes went vacant, his hand moving faster than his small frame should allow, as though guided by something beyond him. The townspeople began to fear the drawings themselves. They whispered that each piece of paper carried a curse, that to look upon it too long was to invite death closer. A few dared to keep them as curiosities, tucked away in hidden boxes. Others swore they burned them immediately, watching the paper curl and blacken in the fire as though it were alive. Yet even burned, the memory of those disturbing images lingered. Look closely at the descriptions that remain. The coffins were always too detailed, sketched with lines far beyond a child's ability. The windows of churches matched perfectly. The clothes of mourners were not vague impressions, they were exact, recognizable, and chilling. Even the weather was captured, a gray sky, a sunlit field, or the blur of rain slanting across the page. How could a boy so young have known? His family grew more secretive. When neighbors visited, the boy was often hidden away, his drawings locked in a wooden chest. But rumors say that at night, candlelight flickered from his window as he sat hunched over paper, drawing in silence while his parents whispered in the next room. Some claimed they heard chanting, a forbidden language spoken by his grandmother in a voice too low and guttural for her age. Others believed the boy's gift was not his own, but something passed down through blood, a chilling inheritance from a strange family bound to a sinister past. The drawings began to take on a more personal tone. Not only strangers, but familiar faces appeared. A teacher, a neighbor, even his own father. Some sketches showed people still alive, yet placed beside coffins as though waiting for death to claim them. The boy never explained why. He never defended himself. When asked, he simply said, "It is already decided." Disturbing details circulated among the townspeople. One woman claimed she saw him sketching a child in a coffin, a child no one recognized. Days later, A visiting family lost their youngest daughter to a sudden illness. Another man swore he had glimpsed a page showing himself, pale and rigid, with a rosary folded between his hands. The man laughed it off, until he collapsed in his field weeks later, dead before the priest could arrive. Whether coincidence or something darker, the pattern was undeniable, and the boy, frail and pale, seemed unmoved by it all. He did not cry, he did not laugh, he simply drew, as though he were not a child at all, but a vessel for something unseen. Even the few surviving images, faded, torn, or half-burned, still carry a disturbing weight. Scholars who study them today remark on the eerie realism, the unnatural detail. Some refuse to handle them entirely, claiming that the paper itself feels cold, as though it had absorbed more than just charcoal and ink. But the most unsettling truth is this: the drawings were not warnings. They were not guesses. They were records of what was to come. Records that could not have been known in advance. Records that blurred the line between imagination and prophecy. And yet these were only the first. For in time, the boy would produce a drawing unlike any other. A sketch so haunting, so unexplainable, that it would forever bind his name to one of the darkest mysteries of 1887. It was not a stranger he drew. It was not a neighbor. It was himself, his own funeral, captured in charcoal long before it became reality. The whispers began slowly, like a draft creeping beneath locked doors. At first, it was nothing more than murmurs exchanged in church pews and over fences. A sickly boy with strange habits, drawings too dark for childhood. But as the weeks passed in 1887, those murmurs became something heavier, something sharp-edged and dangerous. They became fear. People said the boy was cursed. Others swore he was a vessel, an unwilling host for visions too grim for the human mind. In a century already steeped in superstition, when death seemed to hover in every shadow, it did not take long for suspicion to spread like rot. This was, after all, an age obsessed with omens. A black dog at the crossroads. A clock stopping at the exact moment of death. A mirror covered in cloth to prevent the soul from becoming trapped. These beliefs lived side by side with daily life, shaping how families mourned, how they prayed, and how they feared. The boy's drawings fit too neatly into this web of dread. Each sketch appeared to predict death. Each funeral he traced in rough charcoal came to pass. And so the townspeople began to whisper words they dared not say aloud. Prophecy, curse, devil's child. Look closely at the records that remain. Letters exchanged between villagers describe the unease that spread through the community. He is not like the others. One woman wrote, "For what he sees in his head is not the world around him, but what lies beyond it. He is not a boy, but a window." Another note, tucked between the pages of a priest's journal, mentions a child whose hands move as though guided by something unseen. The priest's handwriting falters after that line, as if even writing the words felt dangerous. The family, already considered strange, withdrew even further. Their house, once open to visitors, became shuttered and dim. Neighbors claimed to hear footsteps at odd hours or low murmurs in a forbidden language, words too old, too heavy, to belong to ordinary speech. Some swore the grandmother's chanting could be heard through the walls, her voice carrying a cadence that belonged more to ritual than to prayer. And then there was the boy himself. He grew quieter, his health more fragile, yet he seemed unafraid. When asked why he drew such things, his reply was always the same: because they will happen. It was not only his family who noticed. The townspeople began to test him, though few admitted it openly. A woman once asked him what he saw for her husband. He looked at her with eyes too hollow for his age and replied, "A black coat, a cold night, a bell." Days later, her husband collapsed in the street, dead of a sudden heart attack, his body carried home in the black coat he had worn to work. And yes, the church bell rang at midnight as his coffin was lowered into the ground. The whispers thickened into something poisonous. Mothers told their children not to look at him, lest his visions latch onto them. Men avoided his father in the tavern, muttering that the family harbored demons. And when the boy passed through the marketplace, silence followed him, broken only by the sound of shuffling feet as people moved out of his path. But not everyone dismissed him as cursed. Some began to see him as a prophet, a fragile child burdened with knowledge of what was to come. They compared him to seers in old stories, to saints who had visions of death and salvation. A few even brought him offerings, small crosses, flowers, or coins, left quietly at his doorstep, as though appeasing him might keep death away. The priest, torn between doctrine and dread, visited the family again. He recorded little of what was said, only that the boy's drawings carried with them an undeniable weight. The priest begged the parents to stop the child from sketching, to destroy the papers before the town's unease turned into violence. But the parents, weary and silent, offered no promises. And the boy simply kept drawing, as though he could no more stop than he could stop breathing. Even the boy's posture began to unsettle those around him. He would sit in corners at gatherings, silent, eyes scanning the room as though measuring the weight of each life. Some swore he lingered longer on the faces of those soon to die. Others claimed he muttered words under his breath when he passed graveyards, as though speaking to someone unseen. And then came the drawing that shattered whatever fragile patience the town still held. Not a stranger, not a neighbor, but himself, his own coffin, his own funeral, drawn with an eerie calm. The detail was unmistakable. The church, the mourners, the small wooden box, his own name written beneath a headstone that had not yet been carved. The whispers of premonition had become something else entirely. This was no longer about the deaths of others. This was about a child who claimed to see his own end, and who captured it in charcoal long before it came to pass. What could such a drawing mean? Was it a child's twisted imagination? Or was it fate itself, recorded in shaky lines and smudged shadows? The answer would soon be revealed. The year was still 1887, and the town had grown used to the boy's strange sketches, if used to, could even describe the uneasy tolerance they held. Each drawing had left behind a trail of unease, a lingering suspicion that fate itself was being carved onto paper. But nothing compared to the day he revealed the one drawing that changed everything, the drawing of his own funeral. It was discovered, not given. His mother, weary from washing, had gone into his room to collect the scraps of paper he so often left scattered across the floor. She had grown used to the smudges of charcoal staining her hands, to the morbid scenes he sketched in silence. But this time, as she picked up the latest sheet, she froze. What she saw nearly made her drop it. It was unmistakable. The narrow church, drawn with the same shaky precision he always used. The rows of mourners, their faces blurred yet heavy with sorrow. A coffin, small, almost child-size, lowered into the earth. But what made her blood run cold was the inscription, written with a deliberate hand at the bottom. His own name. The boy had drawn not just another funeral, but his own. The mother hid the drawing, tucking it into a locked drawer. But secrets in small towns never stay buried. Soon, whispers spread faster than fire. Someone, perhaps a sibling, perhaps the father, let slip what the boy had drawn. Within days, the entire town was talking about it. Some laughed nervously, saying it was nothing more than a child's obsession with death. Others were convinced it was a prophecy, an unholy glimpse of what was to come. The priest was summoned again. He looked at the drawing in silence, lips pressed tight. When he finally spoke, his words were grave. This is not the imagination of a child. This is something darker. He urged the family to burn the paper, to rid themselves of the omen. But the boy refused. When they tried to take it from him, he snatched it back, holding it to his chest like a treasured possession. "You can't stop it," he whispered. "It's already waiting." Accounts from the time describe how fiercely protective he became of the sketch. He would sit for hours staring at it, his small fingers tracing the outline of the coffin, as though memorizing every detail. Neighbors claimed they saw him speaking to the paper when no one was around, muttering words they could not understand. His siblings, terrified, swore he sometimes smiled faintly at the drawing, as if it brought him a strange comfort. The more people learned of it, the more unsettled they became. A funeral drawing was one thing, but a child calmly predicting his own death was another. Mothers warned their children to stay away from him, fearful his fate might somehow rub off on others. Men at the tavern muttered that no good could come from a child so willing to stare death in the face. And still, the boy seemed eerily at peace. Then came the small details that drove the fear even deeper. He began to describe the scene out loud. The hymn that would be sung, the pale flowers laid across his coffin, the exact number of mourners who would attend. He spoke of them not as guesses, but as certainties, facts already carved into stone. When asked how he knew, he would only reply, "Because I was there." The priest grew more insistent. He warned the parents that the boy's visions, whether real or imagined, could tear the community apart. Superstition ran deep in 1887. A child predicting his own death was not merely unsettling, it was dangerous. There were whispers of curses, of witchcraft, of a family tainted by dark forces. And always, there was the drawing, folded carefully in the boy's pocket, carried with him like a talisman. As weeks passed, his health worsened. The cough that had always lingered grew harsher, rattling in his chest. His skin grew pale, his eyes heavy with shadows. Yet he never once seemed afraid. "It won't be long now," he told his mother one night, clutching the drawing close. She begged him not to say such things, but the boy only smiled weakly. "You'll see," he whispered. "It will be just like the picture." The townspeople, sensing his decline, began watching with grim fascination. Some pitied him, believing the child was haunted by visions he could not control. Others saw his illness as proof of the prophecy, a slow march toward the funeral he had already drawn. There were even those who avoided the churchyard altogether, too afraid to be present when the boy's prediction finally came true. And then, his words began to echo. The hymn he had described was rehearsed by the choir for an upcoming service. The pale flowers he mentioned were spotted blooming near the churchyard. The small coincidences began to stack, each one tightening the grip of dread on the town. It was as if the world itself was arranging itself to match the drawing. The boy's funeral drawing was no longer just a sketch. It had become a countdown. And as the year 1887 moved toward its close, the question was no longer if the drawing would come true. It was when. The year was still 1887, and though the world outside the small town seemed to move forward with its ordinary rhythm, inside the boy's household something had shifted. The drawing of his own funeral had not only unsettled neighbors, it had cast a heavy, almost suffocating shadow over his family. They could no longer escape the whispers. They could no longer pretend life was ordinary. The father, once a proud man who worked the fields with steady hands, now walked with shoulders hunched, avoiding the gaze of those he passed. People muttered when he entered the tavern. They said the family was cursed. They said the boy had brought something unnatural into their lives, something that clung to all of them. And in that year of deep superstition, such talk was more dangerous than disease. The mother fared no better. She spent her nights weeping silently, torn between fear of losing her son and shame at the attention the drawing brought. Women who had once been her friends crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. Some whispered that she had fed the boy tales of death, poisoning his young mind. Others believed she had bargained with something unspeakable, that the strange child was the price she paid. Even within the walls of their home, the shadow grew thicker. His siblings, once playful and loud, now kept their distance. They slept with blankets pulled tight, whispering prayers against the darkness that seemed to stalk their brother. They claimed they saw him wake in the night, standing by the window, staring out at the churchyard, as if waiting for it to call him. The boy himself seemed eerily calm amidst the storm. He carried his funeral drawing folded neatly in his pocket, smoothing it out each night before bed as though checking a map. Sometimes, his mother caught him speaking softly to it. She swore he used words she did not recognize, sounds that didn't belong to their language, an unsettling murmur that chilled her blood. A forbidden language, she thought, though she dared not tell anyone. The priest's visits became more frequent. He urged the father to renounce the drawing, to destroy it in the churchyard fire. But each time, the boy refused to surrender it. He would clutch it to his chest and whisper, "It is already written." The priest, frustrated and fearful, warned that if the family did not act, they would bring ruin upon themselves. Still, no one dared take the paper by force. And so, the house itself began to feel cursed. Lamps flickered low, shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls. Neighbors claimed to hear faint weeping drifting from their windows, even when no one was awake. A girl who lived nearby swore she saw a pale figure standing in the boy's room at night, leaning over his bed. Her parents hushed her, but the rumor spread. Soon, people said the house was haunted. By late autumn, the family had become pariahs. The father struggled to sell his crops. The mother could not buy bread without enduring muttered prayers behind her back. The siblings were taunted as children of the cursed one. Even the boy's illness, his hollow cough and fragile frame, seemed to fuel the idea that something unholy was at work. The strain pushed the family to breaking. Arguments broke out behind closed doors. The father accused the mother of indulging the boy's morbid fantasies. The mother accused the father of cowardice, of failing to protect them from the cruelty of the town. And all the while, the boy sat quietly at the table, drawing more and more. His eyes seemed older than his years, as if he carried the weight of generations inside him. One night, the mother finally broke. She tried to burn the drawing herself. She crept into his room while he slept, carefully pulling the paper from beneath his pillow. But the moment the edge of it touched the flame, the boy bolted upright. His eyes were wide, glassy, almost inhuman. He screamed, a sound so piercing the neighbors claimed it echoed through the entire street. He ripped the paper from her hand, unscorched, untouched by the fire, and with a trembling voice he whispered, "You cannot change it. It's already waiting." The family never tried to take the drawing again, but from that night onward, their house seemed darker, colder. The boy's health declined rapidly. His coughing fits left streaks of red on his pillow. Yet despite his frailty, he walked with strange determination, often disappearing into the churchyard for hours. Some said they saw him sketching there, perched atop the crumbling wall, staring at the ground where his coffin would soon lie. By now, the family lived in silence, bound together not by warmth but by fear. They no longer dared invite visitors. They no longer shared meals without the oppressive shadow of the drawing hanging over them. Their home had become a place of dread, a prison where each passing day was a step closer to the inevitable. The boy's siblings avoided him altogether. One later confessed, years after the events, that she believed he was no longer her brother at all, that something else had taken his place, something that smiled through his hollow face while slowly draining the family's spirit. The shadow over the family was no longer metaphor. It was real, oppressive, alive. Every photograph of them taken that year shows the same thing: pale, weary faces, eyes sunken with dread, as though they were already in mourning. Forgotten old photos now capture that eerie detail: a family alive, but already grieving a child who had not yet died. And still, the boy clutched his drawing. The map of his death, the portrait of his final day. He carried it like a secret only he could truly understand. And with each passing moment, the shadow over the family grew darker, deeper, and harder to escape. The year was still 1887, and by winter, the boy's strange prophecy had tightened its grip. What had begun as whispers and drawings was now reality unfolding, step by dreadful step. His health had declined so quickly that even the doctor, an old man accustomed to seeing children with fever and consumption, could only shake his head. "He is fading," he said softly, "and nothing we do will stop it." The family knew. The neighbors knew. Even the boy himself knew. His funeral drawing had not been an eerie fantasy. It was becoming truth. Each day he grew thinner, his skin almost translucent, his breath shallow and ragged. He hardly ate, though his eyes remained sharp and unsettlingly calm. He spent his final days not clinging to life, but preparing for death. His siblings recalled how he would sit at the table, staring at them with quiet intensity, as though memorizing their faces before he left. The drawing never left his side. Folded carefully, It lay on his nightstand by day and beneath his pillow by night. He traced its lines with his frail fingers, whispering softly to himself. His mother once leaned close enough to hear the words. They were not prayers. They were not familiar. They were muttered in a strange, forbidden language she did not recognize. She fled the room, trembling, unable to tell anyone what she had heard. And then there were the visions. At least, that is what the family believed them to be. He would wake in the night, staring at the dark corner of his room, his eyes wide with terror. "They're here," he whispered. "They're waiting." When pressed, he said no more. The family never asked again. Outside the home, the town grew restless. Mothers held their children tighter, warning them never to stray near the boy's house. Some claimed they saw shadows moving behind his windows long after the lamps had gone out. Others said they heard faint singing, funeral hymns, drifting into the cold night air. The house was no longer seen as a place of the living. It had become a waiting chamber for death. The priest came one final time. He placed his hand on the boy's forehead and prayed, urging him to renounce the drawing and the dark whispers that followed it. But the boy opened his eyes and said calmly, "You are too late. It's already been written." His voice was thin but steady, a child's voice carrying the weight of inevitability. In those final days, the family began noticing eerie details that mirrored the drawing. The church bell, silent for months, rang unexpectedly, as though testing its mournful tone. A bed of pale flowers bloomed near the churchyard, the very kind the boy had described months earlier. Even the weather seemed to align itself with his sketch, heavy clouds pressing low over the town as though sealing them in shadow. And still, the boy did not fear. He spoke of his funeral with a strange serenity. He told his mother not to cry, that he would be watching from the other side of the drawing. He told his father to carry himself with strength, though the old man wept openly. His siblings dared not go near him, too afraid of what they saw in his hollow eyes. Something beyond their brother, something ancient and unearthly. On one of his final nights, the boy asked to be propped up in bed with the drawing spread across his lap. He stared at it for hours, his lips moving silently. When his mother tried to take it away, he clutched it tightly and whispered, "If you burn it now, I'll be lost, and you'll never find me again." She never tried again. By now, even the doctor avoided returning. There was nothing left to do. The family simply sat vigil, waiting for the inevitable. Each hour was heavy with dread, each breath he drew sounding like it could be his last. Yet through it all, he held on to that sketch, the grim portrait of his own funeral, as though it were guiding him to where he was meant to go. And then came the final morning. His skin was cold to the touch. His breaths came shallow and ragged. The family gathered around his bed, silent, terrified. He opened his eyes one last time and whispered, "It's time." The church bell tolled once, though no hand had pulled the rope. His mother screamed. His father fell to his knees. And the boy, clutching his drawing to his chest, took his final breath. He was gone. The house fell into silence, broken only by the mother's sobs and the faint creak of the old wooden floorboards. Outside, the neighbors swore they saw a figure, small, pale, and shadowed, walking toward the churchyard before vanishing into the morning mist. The boy had drawn his own funeral. And now, it had begun. The year was still 1887, and the boy's death had shaken the family to their very core. Yet for the townspeople, the tragedy was not simply grief. It was confirmation. The cursed child had foretold his own end, and now, piece by chilling piece, the world was arranging itself exactly as he had drawn. The morning after his final breath, the church bell tolled again, this time rung by trembling hands. The sound was hollow, mournful, echoing through the fog-heavy streets. Neighbors emerged, heads bowed, whispering prayers, though none dared speak too loudly. Everyone knew they were walking into a moment that had already been mapped, etched in charcoal months before. The boy's body was dressed in his finest, a suit too small for his thinning frame. His mother brushed his hair back gently, her hands trembling as she whispered words only he could hear. His siblings dared not look at him for long. They swore that even in death, his expression carried a faint, knowing smile. And then came the coffin. Small, child-sized, just as he had drawn it. The carpenter who built it refused payment, muttering that no coin could cleanse him of the task. When the lid was lowered, the family's grief spilled into the air. Yet behind their cries lurked a deeper dread. They had seen this before, not in reality, but in the boy's sketch. Every detail was aligning. On the day of the funeral, the church filled exactly as he had predicted. Rows of mourners sat in silence, their faces blurred by tears, or perhaps blurred by the strangeness of living out a scene they had already been told would happen. Some tried to focus on their prayers, yet their eyes kept darting to the coffin, unable to shake the thought that the boy had guided them there. And then, the hymn began. The very same hymn he had described in those final weeks. It rose from the choir, solemn and haunting, its melody echoing against the old stone walls. The mother sobbed openly. The father held her hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. The priest's voice trembled as he spoke the rites, his words stumbling over the weight of prophecy fulfilled. As the service ended, the procession moved toward the graveyard. Cold mist clung to the earth, wrapping around the mourners like a shroud. Step by step, they retraced the very image the boy had committed to paper. The church, the mourners, the coffin, even the pale flowers, gathered and laid across the wooden box, matched his description. One by one, the details fell into place like clockwork. And then came the final moment. The coffin was lowered into the ground. His name was spoken aloud, carved into the silence of the churchyard. For many, it was too much. Several mourners fled, unable to witness the burial of a child who had foretold it all. One woman fainted. A man swore he saw a shadow moving just beyond the trees, watching with unblinking eyes. Those who stayed claimed the strangest detail of all. As the coffin touched the bottom of the grave, a gust of wind swept through the yard. For a brief moment, the hymn seemed to echo again, though the choir had long since fallen silent. Some said it was imagination. Others swore it was the boy himself, singing from the other side. When the earth was shoveled back over the coffin, a terrible hush fell over the churchyard. The prophecy had been completed. The funeral was no longer just a drawing, it was history. Dark history, captured not in words, but in the chilling alignment of fate and imagination. The drawing itself remained with the family. They kept it locked away, though many urged them to destroy it. But none could bring themselves to burn it. It had guided their son's final days, foretold every moment of his passing, and now stood as the most disturbing relic of their grief. Destroying it felt impossible. It was his last creation, his last truth. The townspeople spoke of it in hushed tones for years afterward. Some believed the boy had been touched by God, blessed, or cursed, with foresight. Others whispered darker theories, that he had been guided by unholy forces, that he had not predicted his death so much as invited it. The truth remained buried, along with his body, beneath the pale flowers that bloomed that winter. Yet there was one detail the family never shared with outsiders. On the night after the funeral, the mother unfolded the drawing once more. And there, in faint smudges of charcoal she swore had not been there before, was something new. A figure in the background of the funeral scene. A tall shadow, faceless, standing apart from the mourners. Watching, she folded it quickly, locked it away again, and never spoke of it. But she carried that image with her to the end of her days. A reminder that her son's funeral may not have been the end of the story. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Yet the shadow it cast lingered. And for those who had witnessed it, life in the town would never feel ordinary again. The year was still 1887, though the boy's death had left the town feeling suspended in time. The funeral had passed, the coffin buried, yet the shadow of his strange prophecy remained heavy over everyone who had witnessed it. For the family, grief was constant. For the neighbors, fear lingered. And for the church, the incident became a burden no prayer could fully erase. In the weeks that followed, the family's home grew quieter, as if the walls themselves were mourning. His siblings spoke little, their laughter gone. His mother carried the locked drawer that contained the drawing like a secret chain to her soul. She never opened it again, though some nights she swore she heard the faint sound of paper rustling in the darkness. The father withdrew into silence, unable to meet the eyes of his neighbors. They all knew what had happened. They all knew the boy had drawn his own funeral. The townspeople, however, struggled with the story in their own way. Some refused to speak of it at all, pretending nothing had occurred. Others repeated it endlessly, turning each retelling into something darker, something less human. They spoke of how his eyes seemed older than his years, how his voice carried words that belonged to no child. They called him a cursed boy, a vessel for forces that should never touch the innocent. And yet, time has a way of blurring even the sharpest memories. By the turn of the century, his name was barely whispered. The tale became one of those unsettling histories parents told in warnings, a cautionary story meant to keep children from wandering too close to death. The boy himself became less of a child in memory, more of a legend. But legends have a way of resurfacing. In the 1920s, long after the funeral, old belongings of the family were unearthed from a trunk in an attic. Among them were yellowed papers, letters, receipts, and sketches. And tucked within, folded carefully, was the drawing itself. The funeral scene, still intact, still carrying his name beneath the small coffin. But there was something different. The faint shadow his mother once described was clearer now, as if it had grown darker with time. A tall figure, faceless, watching. Historians who later studied the paper were unsettled. Some argued it was simply smudged charcoal that had warped with age. Others believed the boy had gone back and added the figure himself before his death. But one unsettling detail was undeniable. The smudge resembled no ordinary accident. It looked deliberate, intentional. Old photographs of the family also raised questions. One sepia-toned image, taken just months before the boy's passing, shows the family gathered stiffly outside their home. At first glance, it seems ordinary: parents, children, the house in the background. But look closely, and you see the boy clutching a folded sheet of paper in his hand, his funeral drawing. Some who examined the photo claimed they could make out faint lines pressed into the fold, as if the sketch itself had bled through the page. And then there was the photograph taken at his actual funeral, a haunting relic of post-mortem photography, common in the 19th century. The boy lies in his coffin, eyes closed, flowers laid across his chest. Mourners surround him, blurred by motion. But hidden in the far corner, behind the rows of grieving faces, is what appears to be a tall shadow. Too sharp to be dismissed as a trick of light. Too faint to be dismissed as a person. It matches the figure from the drawing. For decades afterward, these disturbing images circulated quietly among collectors of forgotten events. They became part of the town's folklore, whispered about by those fascinated with unsolved mysteries and unsettling history. Scholars wrote of the boy as an omen, a child whose eerie gift blurred the line between innocence and horror storytelling. Paranormal investigators sought the churchyard where he was buried, hoping to find signs of haunting. And every time the drawing resurfaced, so did the fear. By the mid-20th century, fragments of accounts began to appear in journals and folklore studies. They described the boy's strange language, his visions, and his unwavering calm in the face of death. Some suggested he had been touched by illness-induced delirium. Others pointed to something darker, a forbidden language, an inherited curse from strange families long forgotten. None of the accounts fully agreed. All of them, however, agreed on one point. The funeral happened exactly as he drew it. And so, his story lived on, not as a simple death, but as a chilling secret lost in time. A shadow that returned whenever the drawing resurfaced. A reminder that some children are not merely children, that sometimes fate reveals itself in eerie details, written not in words, but in disturbing images that cannot be denied. The aftermath of the boy's passing was not silence. It was a story unearthed again and again, each retelling peeling back another unsettling layer, each rediscovery proving that the shadow over his family never fully lifted. It remained, watching, waiting, The year was 1887, and what began as the unsettling sketches of a frail boy ended as one of the most disturbing mysteries ever whispered through the corridors of dark history. He was no ordinary child. His drawings were not mere fantasies. They were maps of fate, prophecies on paper, and among them, the most haunting of all, a funeral scene that revealed his own death. From the moment he first put charcoal to page, his family was marked. The town recoiled in fear. The priest warned of curses. And yet, every line of his sketch came true. The hymn, the flowers, the coffin lowered into the earth, the mourners whose faces blurred with grief. It all unfolded exactly as the boy foretold. Even after the ground swallowed his coffin, the story did not end. The drawing remained. The shadow remained. The fear remained. Whispers of the boy's prophecy passed through generations, carried in half-remembered tales and yellowed clippings buried in forgotten archives. Old photographs resurfaced, capturing eerie details others tried to explain away. A blurred figure at the edge of the funeral, a smudge of charcoal too deliberate to dismiss, a child clutching the paper that told the story of his own death. Each fragment added weight to the legend, turning one family's grief into a horror story that refused to fade. Skeptics argued it was nothing more than a coincidence, an imagination sharpened by illness, a child lost in the grip of fever. But others looked deeper. They pointed to the forbidden language whispered in the boy's final days, to the calm way he accepted death, not as tragedy, but as inevitability, to the shadows said to linger at his bedside, watching. Theories multiplied. Was he cursed? Was he chosen? Or had something sinister spoken to him, guiding his hand as he drew the outlines of his final fate? The truth has never been uncovered. Perhaps it never will. But what remains are the relics, the unsettling history etched into fragile paper, the disturbing images that survive in old photographs, and the memory of a child who seemed to live with one foot already in the grave. And here is where the story turns from history to haunting, because every account, every artifact, suggests the boy's prophecy did not end with his death. His mother saw the shadow in the drawing grow darker. The funeral photograph revealed a presence that no one recalled standing there. And even today, researchers who have handled the paper describe an unease they cannot explain, as if something is still attached to it, something waiting, something watching. It makes you wonder, do drawings merely reflect imagination? Or can they capture something else? Something hidden. Something that should not be touched. Look closely at the boy's story, and you see a reminder of just how thin the veil is between the living and the dead, how fragile the line is between coincidence and prophecy, and how sometimes the innocent are not spared from the sinister past that lies beneath history's surface. The boy who drew his own funeral was lost in time, but his legend is not forgotten. It is whispered in the silence of graveyards, etched in the corners of old photographs, and preserved in the disturbing accounts unearthed by those who dare to look back. His story lingers not just as a tragedy, but as a chilling secret meant to unsettle anyone who dares to hear it. And so, as the final pages of this tale close, we are left with the same question his mother must have asked as she folded the drawing one last time. Did her son truly foresee his own death, or did the act of drawing it seal his fate? Perhaps we will never know. Perhaps the answer lies buried with him, beneath the pale flowers of that forgotten churchyard. Or perhaps the shadow he sketched is still watching, waiting for another child to pick up the charcoal and draw the same funeral once more. This was not just a story. It was an omen. And as the cold night closes in, remember, some drawings are not meant to be seen. Some photographs are not meant to be kept. And some children carry secrets far older, far darker than the world is ready to face. Beware the shadows in forgotten images. Beware the whispers in lost accounts. And beware the eerie details that resurface when history refuses to rest. Because sometimes the past does not stay buried. Sometimes it waits for you.